Hello, fellow audio nerds. I'm Steph, and this is Major Hi-Fi. On this week's episode of What's the Deal With, I was going to go through the differences between PCM and DSD and describe it for you. And I've been researching this stuff for the past week, basically. And man, there's a lot of information out there, and some of it is sort of conflicting. It's really been tough to wrap my head around. This week is going to be both me sharing my experience with listening to PCM and DSD, because that's something I know for sure, and happy to share that information with you. And I can also sort of explain what PCM and DSD are, and just what, the basic, what are we talking about when we talk about PCM versus DSD. But when it comes to how these methods actually work, I'll explain what I can. Maybe some of y'all can help fill in the blanks, because there's a lot of information out there, and a lot of it seems, I don't know, it's tough stuff. But I'm kind of glad to be doing this mind experiment, this sort of brain push-ups with trying to learn it. Anyway, let's get into it. What's the deal with PCM and DSD? PCM and DSD are digital sampling methods. And when I say digital sampling methods, what I mean is that they're methods of representing an analog signal in a digital format to then be played back again. And their goals are basically the same. They want to represent that analog signal in as accurate a way as possible. But there's this sort of compromise that happens, where if you want to replicate the analog signal as clearly, as detailed and accurately as possible, the file size gets really big. And likewise, if you are going to try and make the file size smaller, then basically there's going to be a little bit less information. It'll be a little bit less detailed and less accurate. And while they both have the same goals of recreating that analog signal, their methods of going about that are really pretty different. The most popular one is PCM, and it's the one that we all probably use on a daily basis. This method stores its files in the forms of MP3s, waves, FLACs, all of that sort of stuff. PCM captures the details of this signal via two properties: sample rate and bit depth. Now, sample rate, as you might guess, is the rate at which a sample is taken. So it's basically the number of times per second, and that's measured in hertz. So for example, 44.1 kilohertz. That means this happens thousands and thousands of times per second that these snapshots are being taken. Now, bit depth, on the other hand, defines the number of values that a sample could possibly have. So if we're trying to make this comparison with using pixels to represent an image, right? If you zoom way into the image, you can see the pixels. Those are the individual samples that are being taken. The sample rate would be the number of pixels that are there. The bit depth would be the number of colors, possible colors that the pixels could be. So basically, the higher the frequency rate, the higher the bit depth, the more detail that image will have, and the more accurate to how it was in real life it will be. Now, PCM looks at the amplitude of the signal and then quantizes it, or sort of rounds it up or down to the nearest value based on the number of bits available to represent it. In other words, based on the bit depth. Now, getting into DSD and how its method works is the thing that I've had the hardest time trying to wrap my head around and find examples of that I really feel like I can trust, because there's a lot of information that seems to be kind of conflicting here. But let me share the best way that I can sort of describe it based on the research that I've done. So DSD uses this method called pulse density modulation. In other words, when the signal's amplitude increases, the frequency of pulses increases. Thus, they become more dense together. And when the signal's amplitude decreases, the pulse frequency decreases. Now, when I say pulse frequency, what I really mean is that DSD is just one bit. In other words, it is looking at just ones and zeros as opposed to taking samples and giving it a bunch of different values. Looking at just ones and zeros, when the amplitude is going up, in other words, like when the slope of the curve is up, it will, produce a 1, and when it's going down, it produces a 0, so it can sort of like follow the waveform in that way and recreate it. This happens at a super fast rate of basically millions of times per second. It's 2.8224 megahertz as opposed to kilohertz with the PCM. And then on top of that, because the frequency is so high, DSD uses this tool called noise shaping, where it basically takes, all the noise in the signal, moves it to the highest frequencies, and then cuts those frequencies out. Like I said, this part of it got really hairy for me, and it's hard to sort of find the information that I felt comfortable, expressing like I know, because I don't really. So if any of y'all have more information on DSD, or even some resources to online and better understand it, I would really greatly appreciate it. More importantly, I would love to talk about how these two methods sound, because that's something that I actually have experience with and that I can sort of share my thoughts on in a more meaningful way. Now, the first time that I listened to DSD and PCM right next to each other, I sat down with a player. I had downloaded the same song, just in these two different formats, and listened back and forth to them to see if I could hear a difference. And I felt like I could, and sometimes that happens. There's that psychological kind of thing where you're like, I think I hear a difference, but I'm not sure. So that sort of indicates to me that the difference is pretty subtle if I'm wondering whether or not I'm actually hearing what I'm hearing. That said, I then followed up that listening test with a blind test. I gave the player to my colleague, Garrett, who then flipped back and forth between and had me guess which one was which. And guess what? I actually did hear a difference. And the biggest difference for me came in the form of dynamic expression. One of them, which I'll share with you, felt like it had more of a sort of lifted feeling. It honestly was more of a feeling than an actual like auditory thing. I was listening to Mozart's Violin Concerto in D minor Allegro. There's this part where there's like sort of this violin swell right at the top of the song, like 10 seconds in or so. So I sort of listened to those two things, like, that's sort of where I was listening for that change. And every time, I just felt more of a lift when I was listening to DSD. Was it subtle? Yeah, it was really subtle. But did it actually contribute to the emotional impact of the way I experienced that song? It did. And so if you're wondering whether or not you should go for DSD versus PCM, if you're actually in the process of trying to make that choice, I will say, DSD did have something to it, and it's hard to kind of put into words, but for me it just came across as this, I would think, like a wider dynamic range, less signal to noise, a greater signal to noise ratio. You will have to get equipment that can handle that kind of thing, and you can only get certain files in DSD. You can't get every song that you want, so there are certain hassles that go along with getting a DSD system going in your life. But if you want to have that experience, then I think, and you have very sensitive ears like I do, I think you'll really enjoy listening to DSD. Anyways, I hope this vague video was helpful to some degree. And again, I would love to check out any resources you have or any information that you have regarding PCM and DSD. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And for more videos like this that will be more informative and less of me guessing through stuff, be sure to subscribe. Alright everybody, thanks, and I'll see you next time. Bye.